attending this, and now I'm looking forward to the highlight of this award ceremony, the acceptance speech of Jørgen Randers. Jørgen, the stage is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and now friends. I am really happy to be here, and I'm really thankful for this award. I've received many awards in my life, but most of them are for things that I don't think is particularly important. This one is, and so I am really grateful, and it is a great pleasure to hear Ulrik explain the opinions of Gerd very nicely and in a way that I like and agree with. So, thank you. Ulrik did forget a number of important things in his description of me. First of all, he forgot to tell that I'm very old and that I have spent 50 years working for a better world and have failed. The world is less sustainable now than when I started my science-based activism 53 years ago. And that makes me not only old, I am a depressed man with a smiling face. Why do I have the smiling face? Because I have learned that this is the only way to communicate to people. If you are a grumpy old man, you don't get anywhere. But inside, I am a really old and a really grumpy man. Giving talks in Germany is very difficult. I live from giving talks across the planet. And here, the complication that Germans speak so badly English and me speaking so bad German makes it very hard to communicate, and particularly to communicate in an entertaining manner, which is necessary in order to avoid people falling asleep. And so I have pondered a lot, along with the organizers, on how to do this in this audience. And we have come up with a solution which I don't think is particularly good, but it is the best solution. So what I will do now is something that I absolutely never do, which is to read part of my talk. That's the safest way to make sure that no one listens, no one hears, no one understands. But I do this for the record, so that at least there is a well-formulated argument from my side, why the Stiftung is on the right way, when they're working for what they're working. Afterwards, I will try to give a reason for why I think this is correct. But this is so difficult to do in the 10 minutes that I have chosen an approach which is interesting. We have tried to write 15 sentences in German on the screen, and I'm going to say one entertaining sentence in English, showing one figure, and there is no chance in hell that you will get anything out of this, except the fact that I believe that this is important, and you can then do what Ulrik said, Go home and read the manuscript, and perhaps you understand a little bit more afterwards. So sorry for what is coming now. This is not Jørgen's style, but so we start. And so did I misplace this one? I just wanted to see what is the perfect. I give this presentation for one reason only. I wish to help dethrone neoclassical theory as the dominant paradigm for macroeconomic policy analysis, and to replace neoclassical thinking with a paradigm that is better suited to achieve what I see as the ultimate goal, namely high well-being for the global majority on a thriving planet. Sustainable development, in the words of Ulrich. Neoclassical theory, as I see it, promotes the idea that human well-being is best served by maximizing the growth in GDP and to distribute the goods and services afterwards. Neoclassical theory further recommends measuring GDP as in a way which overrepresents the interest of the rich and underrepresents the value of public good, those things that the poor depend on. NCT, neoclassical theory, was a good idea when we were poor and lived in a relatively empty world. It is suicidal, as all the introducers have already mentioned, in the current world, where every move seems to have an impact on everything else, and where the human footprint is already huge relative to planetary boundaries. Neoclassical theory does not give useful guidance on what to do when the negative side effects of growth, more environmental damage, more inequality, and more social tension, starts overwhelming the benefits from further growth. Neoclassical theory simply reiterates the dogma of maximum growth in GDP as the sole solution to all ills, which obviously cannot be the right policy advice when we know that more output leads to more environmental damage, more inequality, and more social tension. So we need better guidance on how to navigate the troubled and rapidly changing world that has been described by the introducers. Neoclassical theory cannot give such guidance. Neoclassical theory gives advice about what should be done to increase the growth rate in GDP in a stylized economy near equilibrium. Neoclassical theory was useful when we were poor and lived in an empty world, as I said. At that time, a bigger pie could make everyone better off if properly distributed. No longer so. Today, in our much fuller world, a bigger pie may cause more intangible disadvantage than tangible benefits. The paradigm shift that has to come, the shift from neoclassical theory to a new perspective on global development, is urgent. People already feel the negative side effects of current growth and are looking for solutions, not more of the same, but a credible, useful alternative. We need a new theory, a new paradigm that does not only handle output growth, but also handles inequality, environmental damage, and social tension as integral elements of the theory. A theory that does not optimize a simplistic linear approximation to the real world, but simulates the effect over time of policy proposals in a realistic, non-linear representation of the real world far from equilibrium. In short, we need a tool that is capable of forecasting the future consequences of contemplated policy change in a rapidly evolving world. Luckily, such a theory already exists. The simulation-based system dynamics paradigm has matured during the last 50 years, but it has always been and still is fiercely opposed by the many who believes in neoclassical theory. This is completely natural. Neoclassical thinkers do not want to lose their position as the chief suppliers of wisdom, and certainly not to a competing paradigm that does not respect the pet dogma of maximum GDP growth, free trade, low taxes, and a small state. We know from history that paradigm shifts take a lot of time, generations. But once the shift starts, it normally happens fast. Furthermore, we know that the shift typically starts when the old paradigm is no longer capable of delivering what it promised. In our case, when neoclassical theory is no longer able to deliver higher incomes for everyone without bothersome externalities. The current waves of extreme weather, social tension, political stalemates, and national breakdown may be the force that finally brings down neoclassical theory and helps introduce an alternative guide to global policy making, what I like to call dynamic macroeconomics for a finite planet. This alternative is a simulation paradigm. It's not an optimization paradigm. It tracks developments over time in response to policy shifts instead of finding the theoretical equilibrium that gives the highest GDP. In the following, I will present the basis for my view in more detail. I use a mild tone, in spite of the urgency, in the hope of communicating across the abyss to the neoclassical theory majority. I don't want to speak only to the converted, the rising minority of heterodox economists. My goal is to accelerate the shift from neoclassical thinking to system dynamics thinking. And that was the program statement. Well read, I think. So, to the boring part. So we spent 10 minutes on the introduction. I will then, and in many ways, I might be tempted to go down and just drop the rest and take questions. It's very hard to see the eyes. I love to have light on the audience because then I can see whether people are interested or not. But you're still sitting at least. That's good. That's good. Okay, so why don't you start waving when you get bored? You know, that's the, or put up a hand and ask a question. That might be actually the best way of signaling that this is getting to be too long. So I have a full, how many? 15 points like this. I will stop somewhere midway because this is not worth the time. So here is, you can read in German and I'll speak in English. Looking 50 years ahead, I see accelerating change and rising frictions between humanity and nature, among nations and within nations, in a world that is getting ever fuller. My picture of the world looks like Gert's, Mr. Schuster's. Everything depends on everything else, and it is very, very difficult to point to a solution and particularly to a solution that everyone agrees on. The democratic society really is having a hard time trying to solve problems like this. Recently, as has been mentioned, my colleagues and I wrote the Earth for All book. The book describes what will happen over the next 50 years if we continue conventional decision-making practices, including the continued focus on maximum GDP. This is the future that we see, and for those of you who love graphs like I do, this is wonderful. For the rest of you, the majority, this is spaghetti. It is spaghetti with meaning. There is normally along the horizontal axis time, starting 1980 to the left and 2100 to the right. Along the vertical axis, a number of things. This is what I believe is actually going to happen during this century, because I do not believe that humanity is going to rise to the occasion and actually do those important policy changes that would easily change this into a better world. So what characterizes this world? It is a world where the population grows, it reaches a peak in the middle of the century, where the GDP continues growing, but it grows at an ever slower rate. There is rising inequality, the gray line. There is continued warming, as Ulrich has been speaking about, and biodiversity loss. There is rising social tensions within and among nations. And there is, importantly, declining well-being in this case. Well-being being defined in a much broader sense than GDP. Well-being being both income, public support, lack of inequality, lack of environmental damage, and lack of social tension. There will be in the future huge regional variation. Some continents are going to do very well, other continents are going to do very badly. Among those, the United States of America. The important thing is the green line, the well-being, which did increase from 1980 to the early 2000s, and then, is now leveling off, and you are looking now forwards to a continuing decline, as I see it, in well-being over the next generation or so, before hopefully the whole thing will level off at a much lower level than it ought to have been. So that's the sad view. The third point, the main conclusion of Earth for All is that the pursuit of conventional policy will lead to higher GDP, but to lower well-being for the majority. And this decline, if allowed to continue for decades, may trigger social collapse, national breakdown. Here is an illustration of the point. Look at what is happening in this likely future. You see the GDP continuing to grow, because there is, of course, increased economic activity in the future, which does not change policy. At the same time, the well-being of people is going down, which shows how useless correlation analysis is. In the past, the two have typically gone together. Now, in the future, they're going to move opposite ways. In an increasingly crowded and turbulent world, where everything affects everything else, one needs a new way to explore the consequences of policy action. It's not easy to foresee what will happen if you do this, that, and the other in a complicated world. And we build models to try to look at the complexity, this is, 1/10 of the Earth model, that Earth for all model that we're using. You see already at this level, it is everything. This is another type of spaghetti, which shows causal relationships between important variables in the system. And the only conclusion you can draw is that it is complicated. And that if I explained one of these relations to you, you would nod and say that, yes, that relation, I believe that exists. I shouldn't start because then it takes too long time. So the big question is, what will happen? And then comes number 5. It is no longer enough to study the effect of proposed policy on GDP, because we saw that GDP was going up and well-being is going down. So one has to look broader. One must study the effect on all variables that influence human well-being in a mature way. So then we have to start by defining what we mean with well-being. Luckily, there exists in the world a couple of countries, some organizations that have discussed the question of what is well-being for the last 20 years in a typically democratic manner, and they have managed, surprisingly, to agree on 5 dimensions that they think are fairly universal, and we have adopted that view. So we think that one should look at 5 dimensions: disposable income, how much public services there is available per person, how equal society or lack of inequality, for the simple reason that people get irritated when there is inequality. It's not only unfair, it just generates frustration in society. It's important to live in a good physical environment and in a society where there is not social tension, frictions. Six, it is no longer enough to use linear thinking and estimate the effect on a final equilibrium. One must accept the reality of circular causality and the need for new mathematics, which is differential equations, and instead of the linear algebra that most economists know, which is the only thing they know. Luckily, Ulrich did this for me already. So the point is, here I would like to make the point. Again, here is the illustration where you have the GDP per person to the left in the center, which is determined by population and GDP. And of course, as Ulrich explained, population growth leads to population growth rate leads to population growth, leads to population, leads to GDP per person, GDP growth, etc., etc. And the main point is that the world isn't open-ended like the left-hand side, it's closed like the right-hand side. Both the population growth and the economic growth are functions of GDP per person. And if you then ask a linear person who can only linear algebra to solve the one to the right, he can't do so. This is the chicken and egg problematic. And the point is that in order to understand the world, you must accept that chicken beget eggs and eggs beget chicken. And that's the way it is. Demand leads to supply and supply leads to demand. Development leads to removal of poverty. The removal of poverty leads to development. Both are there. It is, the discussion between demand economics, demand-driven economies, and supply-driven economies is an open-ended, non-circular causal thinking. And is a real problem. This simple thing that the world does not look like the left, it looks like the right. And you need the tools to solve the one to the right. It is no longer enough to study the effects of policy change in the short term. One must lengthen the time horizon to cover the feedback effects triggered by the first move. And here I'm going to use another example. Most neoclassical and other people are very enthusiastic when the savings rate goes up. And why? Because they think linearly, like the left-hand thing. Higher savings rate leads to higher savings, leads to more investment, leads to more GDP, more jobs. So everyone is happy. The reality is, of course, the right-hand thing, that you start with the savings rate, it increases savings, increases investment. But of course, in a stock and flow consistent system, that leads to capacity increase, capacity addition, it leads to more capacity, leads to more output, leads to more GDP, leads to more income, leads to even more savings. So if you increase the savings rate, you don't move into a new equilibrium, you move into a higher growth rate of the economy. And vice versa. If you lower the savings rate, you don't get into a new, stable, controllable situation. You actually start, moving down forever. Eight, and this is suggested by Mr. Schuster. It is no longer enough to study flows. One must track the changes in relevant stocks, since normally it is the accumulated stocks that determine what happens next, not the flows. This is Greek for most of you, but I say it loud because it is important. And here is the important picture. If you want to study the dynamics of population, you need to understand this picture, that you get born here to the right. You move into the age 0 to 20 group, you move on to the 20 to 40, you move on to 40 to 60, you move on to the 60 plus, and then you move on to me out there to the left. Fine. And once you make this drawing, people start understanding that the Prime Minister of Norway is an idiot when she is worried about the lack of labor in workforce in Norway, and she is encouraging Norwegian women to have more babies. That's a good policy, huh? So how long time does it take from her advice until this leads to a new person that is capable of working? In our country, where people go to school for 10 years, so by 25, you might perhaps have a person who could enter the workforce. Vice versa, when you lower the fertility rate, the time it takes before the dependency ratio actually starts changing is very, very long. And so the scare about aging society, etc., has been around for 30 years. Yes, we're now starting to get there. But meanwhile, the number of young is starting to decrease, so that the growth in the dependency ratio measured in the proper way, namely old plus young divided by those that work, does not increase as much. Stock and flow consistency, very important. You can read while I leave. It is no longer enough to rely on economic data, time series data in dollar terms. It is always helpful and sometimes necessary to supplement with non-economic data, physical flows, and even in some cases, very hard to quantify soft science impressions. This has been mentioned both by many of the people before me. I would like to show an example. This is, as I see it, the main threat to well-being in the rich world over the next 20 years. This is the process, self-reinforcing process, that can generate social collapse and is already doing so in some of the countries that you know too well. So the point here is that in order to solve a problem, if you have a problem, the government needs capacity to act, because then they can put in place work that improve well-being, which will then lead to better well-being, which then lead to perceived progress, which reduces social tension, which increases the trust in government, and you have a positive spiral where it is possible for a dynamic government to actually provide goods and services to the public and then get re-elected and get the support for further taxation in order to improve the situation. And the point is, of course, that if this one goes in reverse, if you are in a situation where people feel that well-being has been falling, where the perceived progress is declining, social tensions starts to rise. This is the rise of the right wing, you know, in many European countries, which reduces the trust in the government, which makes it difficult for the government to do anything, even if they wanted to do it. And that is the social collapse mechanism. And as I said, my main worry about the well-being of rich world, German and Norwegian people over the next 30 years is this one. It's not environmental collapse. Climate collapse is going to come, but it comes on a 100-year time horizon. This thing could hit next week. Hamas entry into Israel is an example of something that, you know, has now lasted for 30 years. You know, finally people get so irritated by the decline in well-being that they start doing something. Although what they're doing doesn't help solving the problem, it is typically an example of collapse. It is no longer enough to study, build theory based on historical correlation. The focus must be on the underlying causality, cause and effect relationships. And this has already been mentioned many times, so I don't need to do anything else except showing this graph, which along the horizontal axis has the wealth of the nation, and along the vertical axis, the growth rate of that nation. And you see that when you're poor, you can grow very fast. When you're around $10,000 per person a year, which is where China was 5 years ago, you know, it grows very fast, and then you go down to the right-hand end where there is no growth in GDP per person. And this happens in all regions of the world. There is, of course, great variation. And the explanation for this is that there is lower productivity rise in services than there is in manufacturing, and consequently you get this aggregate. This is non-linear and causal. It is no longer sufficient to assume a linear response to an increase in an input. The real world includes non-linearities, which tend to dominate system behavior when the system is pushed against the limit. And here I illustrate with a very complicated graph, which makes one point, namely that it is not true that energy use per person increases when you get richer. It stays more or less stable. Look at the blue line. This is the blue line for the United States of America, which is the energy use of Americans have actually been going down during the last 20 years, you know, while their GDP per person has grown dramatically. So we are in a very different type of situation than what most people believe. And so there is, luckily, declining returns also in the use of energy. Then I'll accelerate, because now it is getting late. There already exists a practical and mature method for the study of complex systems. System dynamics could become the mainstream guide to better policy. but it is fiercely resisted by neoclassical theory. The strength of system dynamics paradigm is illustrated by the Earth for All model of human well-being on a finite planet towards 2100. The model helps clarify the consequences of radical policy to stop the decline in human well-being. This is the spaghetti diagram for, this is still a simplified version of the representation of the world. And here are the 5 things that we think should be done to the world. And here you can see it works. I stop everything else because the point is simply that when you start handling a really complex system where you shy away from the totally simplistic neoclassical macro descriptions, you know, you get into computational types of problems and they are solvable. So here you see how the well-being actually does increase in the future. I was asked to make a point about the difference between these 2 solutions. And when you look at the left-hand graph, you see what happens to well-being in the business as usual scenario. It goes down for 30 years and then it levels off. And then if we put in place our 5 extraordinary actions, the well-being goes up. Look at the effect on the GDP. The GDP is essentially the same. It's the same activity level in those 2 futures because there is more or less the same number of people. And of course, everything is similar. The difference is simply that in the second one to the right, people work on different things. So they produce electric cars instead of producing fossil cars. They build windmills instead of building coal-fired utilities. They run agricultural activity without damage instead of doing it in the industrial manner. So it's a shift in the structure of the economy. Luckily, those people who invented the GDP, they measure activity at market value. And luckily, the market value of an electric car is higher than that of a fossil car. So when you shift, you know, the GDP, you know, doesn't fall. What falls is, of course, the real consumption. So, but that's for the guys focused on GDP, you know, they will not mind, you know, if we do this shift, or they shouldn't mind. Good. I'm getting very close to the end. So this is the conclusion. Neoclassical theory is not suited to describe the real world in a manner which is useful for long-term policymaking. But simulation modeling can help. So, what to do? In my mind, the best way forwards is peaceful coexistence between system dynamics and neoclassical theory. There is no way we heterodox economists who represent perhaps 15% of the total number of economists will, in the short term, win the battle. Neoclassical theory is so entrenched in the thinking of not only academic economists, but all practicing businessmen and politicians and the whole right-hand side of the political spectrum. So we will not win in the short term. Hopefully they will do a huge mistake at some point in time, you know, which will prove neoclassical as useless as it is. But this may take time. So I think meanwhile, one should try to build, you know, the system dynamics type of community in the quiet. There is luckily some hope because we are in a situation, promising sign number 1. We see increasing willingness by politicians to deviate from neoclassical dogma. So we have seen the German subsidies to renewable energy. We have seen the Norwegian subsidies to electric cars. We have seen the UK subsidies to offshore wind. We have seen the US support to domestic renewable energy, which is the same as starting to breach with the free trade dogma that has, of course, ruled the world for the last 40 years. And we see the EU even, moving to protect domestic industry with a border cost adjustment for CO2 fees, which is the same as introducing customs. They don't use the word customs because that's anathema, inside the neoclassical community, but that's what they're proposing. So we are starting to see a deviation. And we have finally the result that China has deviated from neoclassical theory for 40 years and produced a tremendous result, where they're now exporting more electric cars than Japan is exporting fossil cars last year. So they've cornered the electric car market along with the solar panel, all through industrial policy, all through planning, all through high taxes, and all through a strong state. No. Well, sorry, it's like, sorry. Okay, the other thing I wanted to say, the second promising sign is that theoretical innovation is now led by practical policy making. We no longer have the situation that the academic neoclassical people come up with creative new solutions to problems. It's actually the other way around, that it's a stuttering democracy with, half-oriented politicians that experiment and start to come up with solutions. And then the economists run after and say that this is not good or this is not good. But we have turned the whole thing around, which in my mind is promising, because this is just like in physics, in astronomy, where typically, people do observations and then the theoreticians have to change, the theory. And we might actually be getting close to that situation. And that leads me to my final point, which is the attempt of not being the grumpy old man, but to say that we may actually live, or at least some of you will actually survive, to see the introduction of system dynamics as a competing paradigm for global policy making on a finite planet with a lot of people on it. Thank you very much.